Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
The first 5 episodes of this new season 6 have all focused on Scott and me coming to terms with our liberal Christian theologies. For both of us, our faith was really shaped within the fundamentalist evangelical world, but in the process of exploring what exactly that worldview means and requires of us, we both found it necessary to let go of many parts of that faith system and to completely reshape other parts. And we both would say our faith now looks nothing like the one we had in our teen years. Is that right, Scott?
That would be correct, yeah. I mentioned before that my journey is kind of different from yours in the sense that when I was younger, I was raised in a very liberal environment and then switched to a pretty fundamentalist approach. And then I won't say I made my way back, but certainly moved a lot further toward the kind of original than,
And so that fundamentalist evangelical period, Scott, that was more in your late teens, I'm guessing.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's your formative years, and that's what I meant by that your faith began when you were younger, but really where you began to develop it was in that fundamentalist evangelical world.
Yeah, that's true. Absolutely. The only thing I would add is that having been raised in a more, I guess, maybe skeptical, more scientific-oriented worldview, that never left me. In fact, I remember even when I first embraced evangelical faith, there was always this nagging side in the back, right? And that conflict started right off the bat. Like I wanted to believe many of these new things, but it was always a struggle, even from the very beginning. So it's not that I didn't embrace them, but I never embraced them, I don't think, with the level of certainty that many of my peers at the time, kids who had been raised in Christian homes, with that same level of certainty that they had.
So what we're doing today is comparing and contrasting between you and me. So as I've said to the listeners many times, my faith began technically when I was just a kid and I was growing up in a Christian Reformed setting right up until I was roughly 15 years old. And really, it didn't mean anything to me. It was the kind of thing you went to on Sundays. It was just a place you went to, but it wasn't a part of my faith or my belief system, my worldview. Then we jumped into the Pentecostal world, and I was 15, a young teen, and a lot of things in my life were changing. A lot of worldview shaping events were happening in my world. So that's where I really saw my faith beginning, was when I was 15, even though I'd been in church my whole life. Now, same thing with you, Scott, in the same way where I went from a very low-key, non-emotional faith, Christian Reformed, into a very emotional, very in-your-face faith, Pentecostal. You, Scott, had that liberal beginning, and it probably didn't mean a whole lot to you. You just went on Sundays, but then things changed when you were a teen.
Right. Yeah, I was curious. I was always a curious person, and I engaged with the church to a certain degree, but it definitely, after my introduction into the evangelical world and some experiences and so on, yeah, there was a radical shift. And basically, a lot of my journey, I was trying to reconcile my newfound beliefs or experiences with the other side of my mind, with my rational thinking kind of mind, and try to put those two together, because I was very embraced and loved by the evangelical community, and that was very powerful. And I'll never regret that. I met some of the greatest people in my life in that community, and many still remain good friends. But then there was this idea that in order to truly embrace this new faith, I had to also embrace certain beliefs. So, for example, young earth creationism, just as one example. And so I did embrace it in a sense that I have to believe this. And so I read a lot of stuff, trying to justify young earth creationism, scientifically and so on. But I found it less and less convincing over time. So a lot of my journey was trying to bring kind of the two halves, I guess, in a sense, the two halves of my brain together, that on the one hand, I wanted to, and I did in a sense believe these new ideas very conservative, more fundamentalist ideas, but I was never fully comfortable. I needed to justify them, I guess, or reconcile them with this. And so that was a lot of the journey, especially during my years in seminary and stuff like that. And so I kind of stood out as a bit of a rebel. I remember one of the theology professors, he was talking to somebody else, and that person told me this, and he said, well, the problem people have with Scott is that they're uncomfortable with his questions. I was asking questions that they didn't like or that maybe made them uncomfortable. So, yeah, I got a bit of a reputation for that. And I was young and cocky and arrogant too, I'm sure. That would be kind of an overall description, I guess, of the journey.
Okay, so again, our goal here is to compare my faith journey and yours to see how they're similar, how they're different. You began in more of a low-key liberal Christian environment, and then you got propelled into a very passionate young earth evangelical fundamentalist kind of a world, but you were then beginning to ask some questions that pulled you back out of that.
Yeah.
My version of the story has me coming out of those Pentecostal days, fundamentalist evangelical days, with a lot of the same kinds of questions and leaving it behind. And
Right.
it wasn't that I was neglecting my faith. In fact, the opposite was true. I was investing time and energy to pursue those questions. I completely embraced the faith system that I was in. I went to church minimum 3 times a week, twice on Sunday. There was a midweek and there was a youth group. So there you go, 4 times. Teaching in Sunday schools at all levels, from primary school all the way up to youth group and college and career group and adult groups, worship leading, church board member, elder. I worked at a summer camp, went to revival rallies. And also there's a personal, internal, the countless hours spent in Bible reading, prayer, meditation reading. So it wasn't that I just let my faith grow cold, as it were. It was that my faith, I think you used the phrase in the past, Scott, maybe it's true of your life too, my faith died by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah. No, well, I think in a lot of ways that's true too. Because like you, I very enthusiastically, I mean, I became, very passionately engaged to the point, of course, of going to seminary with a goal to pursue theological education. And particularly at the time that I entered a seminary, it was to work with troubled youth, which I had been. So, yeah, and through those years at seminary and so on, I was very, very immersed. But always a bit of a rebel, always these nagging things.
But Scott, if I can clarify the word you used, you said that you were a bit of a rebel. There's a difference between somebody who just wants to rebel and say no to everything versus somebody who doesn't want to have to say yes, right?
Right.
So
Yeah,
you were
that's true.
rebelling against being force-fed,
Yeah.
or am I putting words in your mouth now?
No, no, I agree with you. There was that pressure, and it didn't sit well with me to be, yeah, force fed's a good word for it, and to be compelled to believe certain things that I had real questions about. And so that's where the rebels, I guess, you're making a good point, because I don't think I saw myself as a rebel. I wasn't rebelling for the sake of rebelling. I just had questions and things, but others, of course, started to see that as being rebellious.
Right.
And I remember in one discussion on the issue of hell, I was talking to some other students, and a pastor who happened to be at the school that day, he kind of got involved somehow and chimed in, and basically he started saying, well, Scott doesn't believe that. He doesn't believe, like he started,
This is in
and
your
I'm thinking,
presence.
yeah, this is in my presence. Yeah. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I do though, but he was kind of proclaiming that I didn't really, I didn't really think these things. So, and even within my work in the church, I was unconventional. Let's put it that way. And some of that was just youth, and I made mistakes for sure. But I think they were good-hearted things. I really felt that the church needed to kind of wake up in certain ways, especially with regard to being relevant to the world. I felt very, very passionately about that.
So you said that was in your youth, but you've been going back and forth between at a
Well,
later stage where you were at seminary, you were an adult.
well, I met youth as far as compared to me today. Like when I say my youth, I'm talking about the time in seminary, and so I'm in my 20s, So I meet it in that context. Compared to
Scott, you're
today,
betraying your age. You're like me. Whenever you're watching TV and you see these experts, these
Yeah.
doctors and politicians, and you say,
Yeah,
they're
right.
just a kid.
Yeah, I know. Oh boy, I'll tell you, absolutely. I watch F1 racing. I'm a fan, and watching some of these race drivers, and they get out of their car, take their helmet off. And my gosh, they're 18 years old, they're 19-year old, they're
Yeah.
just kids racing
Yeah.
these mega cars. And anyway, so
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay, so I really want to emphasize this point that in your life, and the same is true in my life as well, you're asking questions, you're pursuing your worldview. You're not just trying to cause trouble, you're just saying this doesn't make sense. And I also, many, many decades later, long after I had a career in science, I also went to seminary where I began to explore these questions. And actually exploring the faith is what leads to walking down this path. People describe the path as a slippery slope and letting your faith grow cold and letting your faith go dead. But no, what we're doing is we're pursuing our faith.
right.
And you and I are not alone. Many, many critically thinking individuals, deeply introspective people, have experienced the exact same thing. Countless people who went to Bible college or seminary in order to equip themselves to be a Christian leader and educator, they went down the same path. They came to the
Yeah.
same destination. And that destination at the end of that path is a fork in the road. It's a decision or a choice. You come to the point where you simply have to reject faith entirely, or you find a form of faith that's sustainable, meaningful, and rewarding. And I think that's where
Mm.
you're at now. That's where I'm at now.
Yeah, no, I think that's a pretty good way of describing it. Coming to a faith that you feel comfortable, you feel that it's reasonable, it's not airtight by any stretch, it's not certain in the sense that sometimes many evangelicals sell certainty in that sense, but it's more dynamic, I think. It's more invigorating in a lot of ways. Sometimes it's restless and disturbing. But, for me, I guess the way I'm built is the only way for me. This type of journey we're describing, you're right. It's very common to a lot of people. And a lot of people, I think, leave the faith behind for these reasons, and they just kind of give up. There aren't a lot of churches welcoming to this type of personality and this type of questing, frankly. So you either have to, in my case, for example, I participate in my church, but I participate silently. I value the social side of it, but I leave it at that. I don't disturb the peace. And that's okay. Like, I've learned to be okay with that. There was a time when I wouldn't have been, probably, but there's no church that is going to tick every box. So, you kind of make a choice. And in making that choice, what I personally look for is authenticity, that even if people are believing very different things from what I believe, that they're authentic, that they're at the heart of it, they display true Christian love and grace. That's what matters in the end. But anyway, that's quite a preamble to getting going here on where am I on some of these issues. So we can dive into that.
Absolutely, Scott. You are under the microscope. Actually, no, you are on
Yeah.
the platform, the podium, and you're going to tell us, where do you stand on some really basic fundamental Christian theology? Why do you still call yourself a Christian, albeit a liberal one? And
Yeah. Well, I
where do you
wouldn't.
want to start?
First of all, I don't like that label, but I've said this many times during our podcast. The quote I love from Kierkegaard: "When you label me, you negate me." So yeah, I don't like to wear. I wouldn't call myself an evangelical nowadays because of what that term's come to mean. But I wouldn't call myself a liberal either, because in my understanding of liberals, and it's probably somewhat different from the common understanding out there. I'm liberal in the sense that I'm more, quote, liberal than most evangelicals. In that sense, yes. But when I think of liberalism, I think specifically, typically, the 19th century type liberalism, which was a movement within theology, and I would not put myself in that camp. So, yeah. Anyway, just to clarify. But I guess the place to start is the beginning, obviously. And so, what about God? And what about just basically believing that there is a God? Because I guess everything hangs on that. If you don't believe that, then the rest of it is, kind of moot. So what about that basic fundamental belief that there is such a thing as God, as defined generally defined by the three Abrahamic religions. In other words, some sort of being that created everything that is loving, as well as Paul quotes in one of his letters, in whom we live and love and have our being. I think there's the term,
Live and
which is
move.
live and move and have our being, which is very, very Greek kind of way of putting things. But Paul had that influence for sure. Yeah. So what about that? So there's two ways, I think, to approach the question of God. It's kind of an outrageous. When I often sit and think about it, I think this is an outrageous question, really, when you think about it. Like, what are we talking about here? There's a certain outrageousness to even the very idea. But there seems to be two fundamental ways of approaching it. One is to try to come up with reasons to believe that there is a God. So look around the universe and look through various philosophical reasonings and so on, and develop the idea, and come to the conclusion that, okay, because of all these things, there's likely a God. That's one approach. And that's usually the approach that you'll see debated on YouTube. That's typically the approach that Richard Dawkins and the so-called new atheists will attack, and so on. It's not my approach. The other approach, the one that I'm more comfortable with, is that God is a starting point. In other words, I'm not going to try to discover all these reasons to come to believe in God. I'll start with a belief in God. And that, at the beginning, that might sound silly. And to some of our listeners, I'm sure that'll be like, you can't just assume God. Well, it turns out you kind of can. For one thing, just as a point, Alvin Plantinga, a very well-known American philosopher, and in full disclosure, a Christian, but nonetheless, he is a philosopher, and he put out a paper a number of years ago that has been well accepted within the philosophical community by both theists and non-theists. And that is to say that belief in God is what he calls properly basic. In other words, it's justified to start with the idea of God, not to reason to the idea of God. Of course, I can't get into the nuances of all he says in that paper, but I think it is pretty convincing. Historically, this viewpoint has been called fideism, which basically means putting faith as the underlying principle as opposed to something that we reason to. So it's a little bit like C.S. Lewis's comment, I believe the sun exists, not because I see the sun so much, but because by the sun I see everything else. And so it's more that kind of approach. Any of these things can be broken down and criticized. And, I'm not saying that any of them are watertight.
Can
Yeah,
I
go
ask
ahead.
a clarification on that one too, the C.S. Lewis quote that you just made? Because I'm trying to think how some of our listeners might be responding to what you just said. So I say the sun, not...
Or I believe in the sun, not so much because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Yeah.
Right. And the point, let's just clarify, there's a difference between taking that statement to say, because I see a lot of good things, therefore I believe in a God because God is good and God creates good things.
No, that's not what
And
he's
then the
saying.
argument against that would be, well, there's equally a lot of bad things in the world. And so can we say that there's an evil God that's created a world just for his sadistic pleasure?
Right.
So that's one interpretation of C.S. Lewis's statement. The other one would be, if I start with let's use the word assumption. If I start with the assumption that there is a God that is good, this makes sense. And then that starts to make sense and things make sense in that
Right.
light.
Right. That's how he meant it. And I'm not saying that that's even above critique, because it's not. But from my point of view, having read through it, hundreds and hundreds of philosophers and theologians and arguments over many years, to me, it's almost like a toss-up. It's almost like you can not believe or you can believe, and there are good arguments on both sides, right? None of them are so airtight that they're compelling. Compelling in the sense that they would force you. You'd have to say, well, you're insane not to believe that. There's nothing like that. And so at some point, I think you choose to either believe that there's something behind all this, and then that will make sense of a lot of things. But the atheist will also say that it makes sense of a lot of things to think there's nothing behind this. So, and I agree with them. It's a choice that one makes. And it's not that one side is so compelling that other than just being a lunatic, to not believe in the world around you, to be a solipsist, which is especially, is something I've often struggled with. How do I know that I'm not the only being in the universe? And this is all these perceptions are just perceptions. And of course, these are things philosophers have struggled with for centuries. But generally, if we see somebody tilting at windmills, if we see somebody out of grip with reality, we put them in a special place, right? We recognize there's something wrong. So there's no argument for or against God, in my opinion, that is so airtight that to not believe it would be just really, really kind of insane. So therefore, in my way of thinking, at some point, you take, I guess, what some refer to as a leap. You say, okay, I'm going to choose to believe that there is a God, and then start to look at other things that might hint in that direction. Okay. So I guess that's where I would be on that philosophical starting point. I would start with God as opposed to trying to reason to belief in God. And
okay, so you said that you begin with the assumption that there is a God, and then you begin a journey where you unpack what that means, and you reap whatever benefits that leads you to, internal fulfillment, a number of other benefits.
Right.
So let me just throw out a few questions that I think some listeners might be asking at this point. Does that God require a belief? That would be one.
Right.
What does that God look like? Is he interventionist?
Yeah. Well, I don't know.
Okay, that's fine.
Right. And I don't. It's just kind of at this stage, at this level, I guess, what I would say is that I'm kind of like the agnostic in a way that says, well, I don't know anything about this God. Who's to say if this God is loving? Who's to say if this God is personal? Who's to say if this God is intervention? All these things. I don't know. But I just think that the universe is better explained with the concept of some sort of mind being behind it than not. One way I've heard it put is materialism ultimately says that the universe can explain itself. And I guess the non-materialist would say, well, no, it can't. That there's got to be something more to this. One thing that we seem to be learning more and more, I listen to a lot of physics podcasts, and I'm not a physicist, but I try to listen to reputable people that are, and I try to make these things somewhat understandable to a layperson. But it just seems that the more we dig, the more paradoxical things are. The closer we come to unlocking the secrets of the universe, the more enigmatic, the more paradoxical things become. And that to me is interesting. And it seems to indicate to me that there's something, either our understanding is off, which could be, or there's just something, the universe doesn't explain itself, that there are paradoxes. And
what you just said, Scott, was that this will be an example of how something makes more sense from the point of view of believing that this universe was created, was designed, was put in motion. That makes more sense than believing. I mean, we dealt with this in the fine-tuning episodes where we talked to a number of very big brain people, including one who was a committed atheist. And he said, yeah, my option is it just happened by chance. Those will be 4 episodes, number 164 to 167. It
right.
doesn't make sense, so I just believe that it happened by chance. And so that's their way of rationalizing the beginnings of this universe that came out of nothing.
Sure.
You take a perspective, well, I'm going to assume that there is a God, and then things that pertain to the origin of the universe just make more sense. They're more explainable.
Yeah, and I think I kind of think of them as hints. I don't think there's anything in the scientifically observable universe that can compel belief in God. I don't think that's the case. However, are there things that maybe point in that direction or hint that there's something more, something transcendent? And I think, yeah, there are. On a number of different levels, I think there are. And so I think it's at least as reasonable to believe that as it is to not believe that, right? So I often think that the God debate often revolves around, what's the rational thing to believe? That if you don't believe what I believe, then you're somehow less rational, you're less thoughtful, you're not quite as bright. Even Dawkins coined this term, the brights, that we atheists are the brights. I just think that's all silly, and unfair to both sides. I think bright people, reasonable people, cannot believe, and right, reasonable people can believe. And in fact,
Right.
as far as history goes, the brighter people in history and the intelligentsia and so on have tended to be overwhelmingly believed in something. I'm not saying they're Christians, but well, that's kind of interesting just in itself to me.
Right.
But yeah.
So I asked you earlier, Scott, on this point of belief, whether you believe or not, I asked the question, does this God require a belief? And if he does, why is he so hidden? Why is he? I mean, we had that interesting conversation with Douglas Lotati last week, and he said it was funny how you look at this God that presents himself to the ancient Jews, and he gives them a name that they're not allowed to pronounce, right? And we can't
Yeah.
see him, we can't touch him, he's unreachable. So,
Yeah.
so does this God require the
Right.
belief?
Well, in one sense, no, I don't think he does. I think that belief is an act of grace. I think it's a gift, really. And not everybody gets that gift. So they go through life not believing. And I don't think that God compels otherwise. Now, of course, the traditional evangelical idea will be that, yeah, but if you do that, you're going to be sent to hell. I don't believe that. That's one of the things
And
that
that's
I
an
don't
important
believe.
point. I wanted to emphasize that, and I'm glad you brought it up. The situation that you're presenting, Scott, where you have a God who says, look, here's some evidence that might lead you to believe in me, and you can pursue that and unpack that in your lifetime. Somebody else is not given that same gift of being able to believe, and they unpack what that means in their life. But that doesn't necessarily then mean that the one is going to go to hell and one goes to heaven. In fact, later on, you and I are going to talk about whether we actually believe that there is a heaven or a hell.
Right.
But you don't link those two. Just because you don't believe does
No,
not mean you're going to go to hell,
no, I don't.
which is very not fundamentalist
Well, no,
evangelical.
it's not fundamentalist for sure. Evangelical, no, generally no, but there are evangelicals who have taken that tack. John Stott, the great evangelical theologian John Stott, he didn't believe in hell in that kind of fundamentalist way, which shocked the world when he kind of came out and said that. So it's not completely out there, but yeah, it's not the mainstream for sure.
Okay.
But yeah, I agree with what you're saying there. So
Scott, I got one more question on God and how you perceive God, and then we should move on to some other points that you wanted to talk about. This is a question I have that for some people it's going to be very controversial, and this will be another example of where they all take 20 steps back and wait for the thunderbolt to hit me.
mm,
Does God need to be outside of time and space? Does he need to be?
mm.
Where do we get that idea? Does it come from the Bible, or is it just a tenet that has come up in human discussion? Does God need to be outside of space and time?
Well, right off the bat, when you say space and time, you're already getting into a really complicated subject, according to the physicists, because we don't really understand what either of those things are completely. But I mean, generally, yes, philosophically and in the Western tradition, God is seen as something transcendent, right? Something beyond space and time.
And there's the key
And
word right
that,
there. You said Western tradition, which is your way of me saying it was a tenet that came up out of human discussion.
yeah, it is. Yeah, sure. That doesn't necessarily mean it's right or wrong, but yeah, it is a philosophical concept. And the relationship of God to creation, that's a big topic. I don't know that I could articulate exactly. Um, I mean, it gets into a different area, I guess. But the question is, does God of necessity need to be outside space and time? I don't think of necessity, no. Do I think she, I don't like using these terms, but is outside space? Probably. Maybe they define space and time, but that relationship between God and creation is very interesting. And of course, there's the theological term called aseity, God's aseity, which is the belief or it encompasses the idea, does God need creation? Is God even dependent on creation? Could God be God without creation? These are really interesting questions.
And this is
Um,
process theology you're getting at.
it could be. It could lead to that, but not necessarily. It's just the question: what is God's relationship to creation? And is it one of complete detachment? That's more like deism. Where creation is kind of put out there and left to run on its own, steam. Or is God intricately interwoven into creation and yet also outside creation? These are all different possibilities. That's the one I tend towards. That, like we earlier quoted, God is whom with we live and move and have our being. That it's all encompassing. It's inside and outside. Intricately linked with creation, but not creation.
Right.
I think any definition of God would suggest, at least, that God is not creation. Although, a pantheist would say that God is creation. The creation and God are really the same. You're talking about the same thing. But to me, that kind of defines God in a way that negates him or her. You know what I mean? Like if
Right.
God is creation, then well, that's what are you really saying then? You're just saying there's creation, right?
Right.
So, yeah, so I don't find that particularly compelling, but it's appealing to a lot of scientists, that idea, that pantheistic idea. And then the process theologians, of course, that God is evolving with creation. And there's some really interesting thoughts
Oh,
along those lines, too. But anyway, that we're diverging.
okay. So a lot of good threads hanging there that we could jump on, but we should move. Scott, what about Christianity and Jesus? Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, well, ultimately, because I do consider myself a Christian, the center of the Christian faith is Jesus himself, right? So, who is Jesus? I think that one of the things that has been very helpful in the last 20 or 30 years are investigations into who Jesus was as a human being. And the very idea that Jesus was a rabbi, for example, was kind of a radical idea. 30, 40 years, people didn't think of Jesus that way. They tended to think of Jesus as a blonde, blue-eyed, white, Western man, not as a Palestinian Jew, who, from what we can tell from the Gospels, even on the most critical readings, was a rabbi, a teacher of some sort that gathered followers, which was not an uncommon thing at the time. There were rabbis that did that, and then lived with those followers for a number of years, and then died tragically. So I think on the historical side of things, I'm quite comfortable with believing that. Some people even argue, did Jesus even exist and so on. I don't give a lot of credibility to that. I think that there's not much doubt that Jesus certainly lived, died amongst us, had an incredible impact on the followers that he gathered, who came to believe certain things about him that we see reflected in the canonical writings of Christianity, the Gospels, but also in non-canonical writings as well, that this human being had an incredible impact on human history. And as often has been noted by people, he didn't write anything. We don't have any records of his own writing, and he didn't lead a movement in any way similar to how other leaders seem to have led great movements. He basically he was from an obscure place. I think he lived in relative obscurity. Even his ministry, I think, was, although locally popular, not big on, not on the world stage. I don't think the Romans took much notice of him, and I think that's reflected in the historical records. We do find records of the Romans talking about Jesus later, based on the Christian movement, and in police records, actually, which is kind of where you'd expect them to probably show up. So I do think there is corroboration of the life of this man and so on, but I do think that the main corroboration, if you want to call it that, are the writings of his followers and the movement that stemmed from his life, his death, and his resurrection, and the teachings that are recorded. And yes, the Gospels there's lots of contradictions. They're definitely not unbiased documents in any sense. They're apologetics. They're trying to say, hey, this guy is someone very special and a fulfillment of promises that were made to Israel and so on. But even read very critically and historically and shedding all of the non-historical elements, I think what emerges is a picture of an extraordinary human being who taught some extraordinary things, and more than that, even though lived them, lived those
Right.
things out. Yeah.
So, Scott, everything you've said so far about Jesus has been about his humanity. Even that last part where you said he fulfilled promises made to Israel, the promises were for a Messiah. The Messiah was supposed to be a human, was not supposed to be a divine cosmic being, but was going to be a human that would liberate them. So everything you've said so far is about the humanity of Jesus. So
Right.
now I want to go in two different directions, and you can choose which way you want to go. On the one hand, I remember from my early evangelical fundamentalist days, those people, but I was one of them at the time, had a real problem with people who emphasized the humanity of Jesus. We wanted to see Jesus as he basically floated off the ground. There was a lot
Mhm.
of basic human physiological processes that you never wanted to imagine happened to Jesus.
Right.
And I'm not going to get into the offensive examples that I've heard people use, but the fact is he was a human, and a lot of evangelical fundamentalist Christians, which I was one of them at the time, just don't want to think that. They don't want to believe that Jesus didn't know things. That was a big stumbling block for me. What do you mean Jesus didn't know? Of course he knew. When he was 2 years old, he could fix a radio, right? Like who says he
Yeah.
couldn't build a space shuttle when he was 2 years old?
Right.
So that's one direction. The other direction is, okay, you've acknowledged the humanity of Jesus. What about the divinity of Jesus?
Well, I do believe he was divine, but but defined in a certain way. Like, so you're right. Like a lot of evangelical, not just evangelical, Catholic, like just a lot of thinking about Jesus is very docetic, which docetic meaning that he was God, but not really man. And the first challenge in the early church was that challenge, that it was very hard to believe God could be a man. Not that a man, yeah. And so that was one of the first challenges to the understanding of who is this Jesus. So the question of Jesus' nature, divine and human, half human, half divine, fully, all these things that they particularly struggle with in the first centuries of the church, and finally came down on some creeds that are still far beyond questioning, in a sense, like they don't resolve it. And that's kind of what I find interesting is at the end of the day, the church of the early period decides that we're just going to affirm this. We're not going to really explain it, but we're just going to affirm that we believe it to be true. Somehow, and it is a mystery, but that somehow this man, Jesus Christ, was also God among us. Now, I believe that, but there's a lot of ways to believe that, if you know what I mean. That I don't believe it in the sense of he was some sort of Greek god walking amongst us, which is often what people do think. And like you said, that if you had asked Jesus in the first century what calculus was, he wouldn't have known. He was fully a human being limited by the knowledge and understanding of the world that he inhabited. However, he also is, I don't like this word in a way, but almost in a sense, channeled God to the world. That in other words, God was active in him, and he had a God consciousness. I don't think he even understood his own mission fully in the beginning. He had an understanding of it, but what you see marking Jesus' life is his willingness to submit to God. That ultimately, even though he doesn't fully understand all that is happening, he believes that he needs to carry it out. So, take the crucifixion. I don't think, now I know it's in John's gospel, and nobody knows what Jesus was saying in his private prayers, unless you believe it was revealed to John, which, it's thought you could believe that. But no matter whether it's John or the authentic words of Jesus, what's clear from the gospel there is that he struggled with what was the purpose of his death. Did he have to die, and those kinds of things. And then, of course, you have the final cry from the cross, quoting the Psalms, why have you forsaken me? So there is a lot of richness there and a lot of ways to understand those things that I think beyond the simplistic kind of ideas that are often propagated by evangelicals, and not just evangelicals, but others as well, that somehow God was, I'm thinking I've had a picture of this, but that, there was these two entities and they were somehow meshed together. I don't think we understand really any of that. For me, the way that Jesus represents God in the world is his desire to bring heaven to earth. In other words, teach us that love is the ultimate answer, that love is the way forward, that love has a price. It's expensive. It involves suffering. It involves a level of submission. And all those things, to me, represent God in the world. That Jesus is a human being, but he also is God in the world. He is God's, well, maybe the best way is the way John put it, that he is God's word to humanity. That if we want to know God's word to us, his thoughts and so on, for the Christian, we see that through the teachings and life of Jesus Christ. That's why he's central to the Christian faith. Believing in God is one thing. That's an abstract notion. You could believe in God in all kinds of different ways. But the Christian idea is that the face of God is the face of Christ. The face of God is Jesus reaching into our suffering. Jesus willing to put himself in our court and be judged by us and be found guilty. And therefore, when God comes to us in Christ, we don't accept it because it forces us to look at ourselves in ways that we don't want to. And so he must die, kind of thing. All of those things, I think, are just really, really rich ideas that have been explored by poets and writers and so on. And to me, it's a unique and compelling story. And if you say, well, okay, but what do you mean that Jesus was God? Exactly. What do you mean? I don't know exactly. And I don't know that anybody does. I would just affirm that in some way, he is the way God enters history. And he is the link, he is in a sense, a bridge, I guess, between heaven and earth, with the goal of not to bring us to heavens, but to bring heaven to earth, to create a better world. And when I look around today at the world and the increasingly disturbing world, that resonates with me more than ever. And so I think that Christians' main goal should be expressing his love and care, especially for the weak and vulnerable, to build a better world here and now, no matter what the future might hold, because we don't really ultimately know exactly what it will hold.
So you've basically answered my next question, but I want to crystallize it a bit more clearly. You've referred a number of times to Jesus' death and to his goal. And so that's my question. What was the purpose of his death, if there even was a purpose? So now I guess we're talking about atonement theory. Did he come to give us an example of how to live to bring this better heaven on earth? So the moral influence theory. I had talked in previous episodes the possibility that he was recognizing that he needed to die in order to light a fire in the hearts of his followers and get them carrying the movement beyond him. Or what is a very popular belief for a lot of Christians, that he had to pay a debt. He had to spill his blood to pay a debt, the whole substitutionary theory of atonement.
Yeah, well, I lean toward the moral influence idea, but not just in the passive sense of, well, he's a good example, we should try to emulate his example. I think there's more to it than that. I particularly find myself pulled toward the idea of Christus Victor, that in his death, there was a triumph over death. By succumbing to evil, he defeats it. Exactly how that is in some sort of metaphysical sense, I don't know. But in a certain, it's almost an empirical fact. Well, it is an empirical fact that Jesus' death resulted in bringing into the world a new concept of love. The way we overcome the world is not through violence and through destruction, but we overcome the world through love and suffering. And that has had huge implications for human history, even though there are so many horrible examples of what religion has done, and the Christian religion is as well as any other. Since Jesus, the world seems to recognize, even progressives, even radical progressives that aren't Christian or anything else, but they believe in love and they believe that in freedom, and they believe all these kind of fundamental, but all these things that they believe, or not maybe all of them, but a good number of these things are actually rooted in Christian history, in Christian thinking. Even though they've shed the Christian side of it, they still believe the moral side of it. And that to me is, extraordinary. And so I think anybody working towards peace, anybody working towards healing, these kind of things, they're all carrying out what Jesus taught, even if they're not doing it in his name.
What you just said, examples of people learning how to overcome evil, not using evil, not using violence, but using love,
Mm,
forgiveness, amongst other things, and not necessarily doing it in the name of Jesus. I immediately thought of Mahatma Gandhi, the peaceful protests and how they basically took down the British government by just sitting down and saying, we don't agree, we're going to resist, but we're not going to hit you. You can hit us, but we're not going to hit you. And then that
right.
reminded me of those marches in America, Selma, the movie Selma that was very big a few years ago. People
Mm,
allowing the police and protesters to beat them, to hit them, to imprison them. But they accomplished their own liberty, and just like the
mm,
Indian people accomplished their liberty through peaceful protests and acts of love, acts of
mm.
forgiveness.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because they broke the cycle of violence, right? Violence is a cycle, right? It's a vicious cycle where we're seeing this big time right now in the Middle East, where the Palestinian extremists, Hamas, struck a blow at Israel, a horrible, horrible blow at Israel. What's the answer to that? Well, Israel just decimate Palestine, and you killed 1,200 of our people, we're going to kill 50,000 of yours. And so, how does this accomplish anything? How does this move us forward? It doesn't. And I don't care. I'm not talking about being pro Palestinian or pro Israel. I'm just talking about pro reality. The cycle of violence is just nauseating and never ending. So, this breaks that cycle. And I think Jesus' teachings in the Sermon on the Mount, on the one hand, yeah, you could look at them and say, well, that's just totally unrealistic. How can you give your tunic and how can you love your enemies and so on? Well, in a certain sense, yeah, it is kind of crazy, but it's the kind of craziness that really can change the world.
And that's what I mean when I've said in the past about how Jesus knew he needed to die. He knew that that had to happen in order to light a fire in the hearts of these followers of his.
Yeah, and I think he also knew the inevitability that that kind of a message is what, N.T. Wright calls double revolutionary. It's more than revolution. It's, revolutionary is to fight the power, but to undermine the power through love, that's double revolutionary. So in that sense, and in many more, I really do think Jesus is the hope of the world. And so that's what compels me toward him. And then, when you get into the kind of metaphysical ideas of who was he kind of, metaphysically, and how was he God and man and so on. Well, those are philosophical kind of discussions that can be interesting and intriguing. But at the end of the day, they don't, in my mind, matter a whole lot. Well, I mean, the writer James in the New Testament said it very clearly, that I'll show you my religion by doing good things, by feeding the poor and so on and so forth. And I think that's bang on.
Okay, Scott, time marches on. We still have quite a few things we wanted to talk about. Why don't you decide? You gave me a list earlier. There's a number of points on this list, but you decide where you want to go in this next part of our conversation, and maybe begin to wrap it all up together.
Yeah, sure. Great. I think that it'd be important to talk a little bit about the nature of faith itself. There are some people asking, well, you the question and me the question, well, what is our faith nowadays? And I think we've talked a lot about some of those things, but what about faith itself? And that leads into, I think, a really important point. So, what is faith? I mean, it's very fashionable nowadays to talk about things as a spectrum. I think we could also apply that to faith, that faith is also a spectrum. So, for example, uh, it's been very rainy here in Victoria for the last week, and it's very cloudy, and they're forecasting rain for another couple of days, and so on. So you could say, well, do I have faith that it's going to rain tomorrow based on the forecast? And I would say, yeah, I do. Like, have probably maybe 80% faith because I mean it's here. The clouds are there. It's raining. It's been raining, and now they're predict with their measuring of wind and all these different things that you do now, that it's pretty likely it's going to rain tomorrow. So I have pretty strong faith that it will rain tomorrow. And then there's, well, the Maple Leafs win the Stanley Cup. Well, that's a whole different kind of faith. That some people would call that a hopeless faith. But that's obviously very much at the other end of the spectrum. That's more just, well, I hope they do kind of thing. So faith can mean everything from pretty strong belief to just kind of a hope. And yet we use the term, and this is the nature of especially the English language, we use one term to encapsulate a lot of things. So people say, well, what kind of faith do you have? What's your faith? When my mother was in her last days, like anybody, she was scared. And we talked about some of these things. And she said, I just have a hard time believing certain things. And I could tell from what she was saying is that believing for her meant being certain of certain things. And I said, Mom, believing and hoping don't necessarily mean 100% certainty. You can have faith in something without being 100% certain of it. And I think that certainty is kind of the bane of religiosity in a lot of ways. We talk as if we're so certain about things, and we often sometimes act in ways that reflect a certain level of certainty. We're so certain that we do this and this and this. The people who drove planes into the World Trade Center, they were certain they were going to be rewarded for that act by their God. That's when certainty becomes pernicious. So certainty then, I think, can become a kind of a pernicious thing. And so when I say that I have faith in God, I have faith in Jesus Christ, I do. But does that mean that I'm 100% certain of those things? Well, no. And that can be a day-to-day thing too. Some days I feel fairly certain. Some days I feel completely uncertain. I've joked before that, some mornings I wake up an atheist and then pray by the time I go to bed, I'll believe again. And sometimes life can be like that. So certainty and faith, therefore, I think are very different things. I think that we have to hold all the things that we believe loosely, be willing and open to changing those beliefs when there's a compelling reason to do so. And those are things that mitigate against a lot of the religious mindset. And that's the reason that I think a lot of people are put off by religious people, because first of all, they know it's probably not true. Like you'll see, my dad's a big fan of the Gaithers. He's not in any stretch of the imagination an evangelical, but he loves the music. But he sits there and he watches them with their big smiles and thinking about heaven. And then he knows the stories of some of these folks. And some of them have had some really tragic things in their lives. And they're not all smiley faced. They don't have that level of certainty that they try to sell to everybody else. We feel like it's a weakness to admit that we don't have all the answers and that we're not 100% positive of almost, or for me, almost anything. But I still hope. I still believe and act on that belief. I might be totally wrong. I might be a fool, but I have to do something. And I find that this particular worldview is more encouraging and hopeful and makes more sense of my life than others do. And so in that sense, I'm a believer. But like the verse in one of the Gospels where he says, I believe, but please help my unbelief. And so I feel very much like that. I believe, but help my unbelief. It's a paradox. It's a struggle. Peter Rollins, one of our guests, I thought was really excellent.
Episode 153.
I'd recommend our listeners listen to that one again if they have a chance. And the other one was Tracy Schaefer.
Episode 114.
Who wrote the book, I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God. They talk about this paradox, and rather than fighting it, kind of embracing it. That at the core of our beliefs, there is this kind of paradoxical tension. At the core of our universe are paradoxical processes. Look up the slit experiment. I was talking to a friend last week, who's a PhD in physics, and he said, if the slit experiment doesn't keep people up awake at night, I don't know what would. Only a geek could say something like that. But the slit experiment demonstrates basically this incredible paradox of how light behaves and so on. And so the universe is just full of those kind of things, If the universe had turned out to be the kind of mechanical universe that Newton thought it was, I think the case for theism would be much weaker. But I think it's much more open-ended than that. And that's not to say God of the gaps. It's just to say that believing doesn't necessarily mean the eradication of all doubt. It doesn't mean complete certainty. And I actually think that's a good thing in many respects, because it's the people who are so certain that are often destroying the world, because they're so certain they're right. We have a president right now south of the border that is, so certain of certain things that he's wreaking havoc with a system that has worked for 300 years, very well. And his followers express that same level of certainty. I don't know if you've been paying attention. They had this breach a couple of days ago where it turns out, that they were emailing a journalist war plans. And I'm listening today to the Senate hearings, and these guys just sit there and there's no admission that they messed up, they made a mistake. No. They're so certain that they just have to spin and spin and spin. And I think we're seeing this is a very dangerous place that we're at in our society when we promote that level of naive certainty. So I'm diverging a little bit there, but that is how I would describe my own, quote, faith. There's a great line in Lord of the Rings, and it's in the movie as well, where Frodo's sitting there with Gandalf, and he's despairing, and he's saying, things are not going well. They're losing on every front. And he says to Gandalf, is there any hope? And Gandalf just smiles and says to him, only a fool's hope. And maybe it is a fool's hope. Paul said that. He said, this idea of the gospel, it is foolishness to the Greeks, and it's scandalous to the Jews. So, yeah, that's kind of, I guess, where I would come out. Then, with regard to how does that feed into the future? Because obviously, for many Christians, that's the most important thing. Where am I going to go when I die, and so on and so forth? Well, the Bible's very ambiguous in a lot of ways. The Bible basically, from my reading anyway, basically says you're going to be with God, kind of full stop, like that should be good enough. The Bible doesn't see it, again, in my view, heaven as a final point for people. Heaven is the realm of God in an abstract sense. The earth is the realm of people. And so when you have these visions in the Bible of final things, and they're always very poetic and metaphorical and fantastical, obviously Revelation, but even in other parts of the New Testament, because we're talking about a reality that we can't understand. But what they all seem to emphasize is that God is about redeeming the world, creation. And then to me, that should motivate us to also be helping in that redemptive process. So, for example, being involved in the environmental movement, I think is a great Christian duty, really, to care for the world that we believe God made, and making that world a better place for generations to come, and maybe transforming that world eventually into a heavenly state. Not heaven, but into a heavenly state, into the world that we can kind of see hints. Paul talks about the world groaning, creation groaning. And whenever I'm walking in the woods or looking at an aquarium or just looking at nature, I feel that groaning. I feel that sense that creation is kind of groaning. It's kind of saying things can be so much better. So working towards that, I think, is a great Christian opportunity. And it's one that we can hold hands with the rest of the world and agree with. Christians are often at odds with society, and that's fine. There are areas where we are always going to be at odds with society. However, this is an area that we don't have to be at odds. The whole world is coming to recognize that we really need to take care of the planet, and Christians have as good a reason or better reason than almost anybody.
Scott, if I may, just in a couple minutes, I want to add to what I recorded 3 weeks ago when I put my own faith system on the table. I didn't get into heaven, but since you have, I'll just put my book into that. I don't know whether there's a heaven or a hell. I might hope that there is, although I'll admit that sometimes the thought of an eternity of doing what, sometimes that's scary. Anyone who's had a taste of retirement, or if you've been to an all-inclusive resort for more than a couple of weeks, you get up every morning and it's more of the same. And even though it's good, it's it's a strange.
Yeah, that's hell.
Thing, right?
That's hell. That's not heaven.
Yeah. Groundhog Day, great movie. So yeah. I don't know about heaven or hell. And the other thing I wanted to say was I'm also quite convinced that Jesus, as a first century Jew, did not understand heaven in the sense that we do today. We did talk about this concept of the soul and the afterlife, the first 10 episodes of this podcast. And that was in turn based on a book that I had written on the whole concept of the soul and the afterlife and how it evolved through the course of biblical history. So I really recommend listeners go to those podcast episodes And if you like to read, I recommend that book. And when Jesus has made reference to the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, it's too easy for us to superimpose our modern Western understanding of heaven on those passages.
Yep.
I'm less convinced that Jesus was talking about a supernatural, celestial, immaterial existence in some far nowhere place, as you said, Scott. I'm more convinced that he was talking about a whole new way of human existence, a worldview, an economy, a civilization here on Earth that was governed by a whole new set of values: love, equality, cooperation,
Yeah.
and respect. And so when he says, for example, he says something like, anyone who says to his brother, "You idiot," that person is standing on the precipice of the fires of hell. This is a passage in Matthew, I think it is. Jesus is not saying that a momentary slip of the tongue like that is going to get you a first-class ticket to an eternal conscious torment in Hades. Instead, he's warning that that kind of a slip of the tongue is only the beginning of a process, a sequence of events. You talked about this, Scott. Violence just begets violence. Anger, division, hatred, unforgiveness, retaliation. This is all the process that just unfolds when you begin in that way. And that's described as hell on earth. But learning how to keep saying, "I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Let's try to work this out." And even, "I love you." Those are steps towards building heaven on earth. So that's
Yep.
my bookend.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, Scott, we've basically run out of time, but maybe, is there any last things that you want to put on the table before we wrap this one up?
Well, the only thing I guess I would say overall is some may be disappointed in what they've heard in the sense that it's not like a fully worked out, comprehensive. And I really struggled in doing this episode, by the way. As you know, Luke, I really struggled with putting this together because I don't know that I have a fully comprehensive, worked out, I don't. It's a work in progress, but I guess I've just tried to touch on some of the touch points, some of the key areas where I've come down in some key areas. And in the title to my outline that I sent Luke, I called it "What I Believe," and then in brackets, "for now." And I think that we can all identify with that. It's, what we believe for now. Yeah, go ahead.
So going right back to the very beginning of our episode, then you push back on the label liberal, but you and I are both certainly not orthodox. We had a chat with Roger a couple weeks ago, and that's one of the hallmarks of a liberal Christianity. We're not orthodox, and we're proudly so. Right?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what the label would be, but yeah, for sure. We're certainly not traditionally evangelical, I guess. And yeah.
Well, we invite the listeners to send in their comments to what you had to say, Scott, or what I said 3 weeks ago, our new liberal, I'm going to use the term liberal Christian theology. Give us your questions, your thoughts, your criticisms, and your "I'm with you there, buddy" type comments. But let's talk about next week. We got 1 minute left. In a few days, it's April Fool's Day. And we have the perfect episode for that universal day of celebrating trickery and beguilement. In fact, this one will be about the mother of all con jobs, the ultimate bamboozle. Have you, the listener, been taken in by the fraud that the church held back science by 1,000 years? The hoax that they burned the Library of Alexandria and the thousands of books that it contained, and that they tortured and killed scientists for discoveries that they felt threatened Christian belief? Have you been duped into accepting the distortion that the relationship between religion and science has always been an unfriendly one? In fact, a vicious war, an armed conflict. Over the next 2 weeks, we're going to talk to the authors of the book of Popes and Unicorns, Science, Christianity, and the Conflict Thesis That Fooled the World. James Ungurianu and David Hutchings. Perfect episode for April Fools.
Yeah, they were great conversations, and I think our listeners are going to really take a lot away from those discussions. So, yeah, perfect.
Stay tuned.
Yeah.
See you next week.
All right.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.